right, ladies. So primarily so far we talked about Judaism and the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament. And now you're going to read about the New Testament and Jesus. And of course, when you're studying Christianity and its history, understanding a little bit about the story of Jesus is important. So the reading will be important. Of course, Jesus was a historical figure who was born between 4 and 7 BC. He lived a relatively normal life, the son of a carpenter, until he was about 30. And when he was 30, he started to speak in public, perform a lot of miracles. He told a bunch of parables, and he just had a lot of wise things to say. And so his words were all written down in what's called the Gospels. Also, Jesus had a pretty incredible end to his life. He was crucified on a cross, which wasn't that unique at the time. A lot of criminals who weren't Roman citizens were crucified on a cross. But he was put into a tomb, and he rose 3 days later from the dead. And 40 days after that, ascended into heaven. And between his resurrection and ascension, he appeared to a lot of people, like hundreds of people. So there were lots of people who saw the risen Jesus. And after he rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, then his followers, his core group of followers, were the apostles. And the rest of his followers were known as disciples. They carried on his message and tradition. And that has been sort of the beginning of Christianity. And then all the people who carried the torch were their successors. So just a little bit about that. I mean, obviously the one thing that is really important in the story of Jesus is his resurrection. And that does separate him from many people, but also just understanding the words that he had to say, the wisdom that he passed on, how he helped us better know God, and how he kind of clarified how we should live our lives was also very important. So the Gospels are the good news, and this is the different accounts of his life, death, and resurrection. There are 4 of them in the Bible. There were more accounts than those 4, but those were the 4 that were accepted into the Bible. And basically what we think happened is that someone sat down and wrote the Gospel according to Mark, and that happened somewhere between 60 and 70 AD, probably closer to 70 AD, because it already kind of infers that Rome had fallen, which we know historically did happen. The Romans kind of drove out some Jewish people, some Jewish Christians, and then they also destroyed the temple in the process. And so historically we know that happened about 68, 69 AD. Christians were already being persecuted. So Nero, the emperor who started that, was the emperor starting around 65 AD. And so it was somewhere between 65, 70 AD. Anyway, he wrote down a gospel, the first of its kind. And then about 10 years later, 15 years later, 2 different people, Matthew and Luke, were writing at the same time with each other, but didn't know that the other person was writing. And so what they contained in their Gospels had a lot of similar information, a lot of which came from the Gospel according to Mark. So we know that copies of Mark's Gospel kind of had gotten themselves to these 2 people. But also they had a lot in common that wasn't in Mark's Gospel, which leads us to believe that there was a source that they both had in common. And we refer to that source as the Q source, from the German word Quell. And it was a German theologian who first came up with this theory. So we think that Matthew and Luke, or whoever wrote the Gospels according to Matthew and Luke, had copies of this Q source along with Mark's Gospel because of the similarities they hold. And then finally, John's Gospel was written last, and it is the most unique. Obviously, if you're going to write a 4th account of something, you might only do that if you have something really unique to say. And anyway, his was written the latest and was familiar with the other 3. Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospel are known as the Synoptic Gospels because when you see them together, they're very similar, and John's is very different. He clearly read those Gospels and was familiar with them, but his is about 90% unique. Anyway, in these Gospels, they have several different reoccurring themes and some different things that your book will talk about. One of which is their Christologies. So Mark written first compared to John written last. Mark's has much more of a low Christology and John's much more of a high Christology. And that basically means that Mark's Gospel focused more on the humanity of Jesus, where John's Gospel focused more on the divinity of Jesus, okay? Also, in Mark's gospel, he introduces this theme of messianic secret. And that just means that Jesus, for whatever reason, multiple times said that he wanted to keep it a secret that he was the Messiah. So he would perform a miracle or do something miraculous, like on the mountain when he transfigured in front of some of his apostles. And then he would say, whatever you do, don't tell anyone about this. Some important things that happened in the Gospels that are rituals that are carried out today. One of which is Jesus was baptized. John the Baptist baptized him right at the beginning of his public ministry. And today we still carry on the tradition of baptism. Also, the Last Supper, right before Jesus was arrested and crucified. At that Last Supper, they were celebrating the Passover meal. And that's a Jewish tradition, but now we kind of reenact the Last Supper in our celebration of the Eucharist. And this is what we call Mass, but the second half of our Mass is roughly based on that Passover meal, and particularly the bread and the wine that Jesus held up and said, "This is my body, this is my blood." So the next chapter will talk about the apostles and how they carried on the mission of Jesus. And so the apostles, again, were kind of this core group of leaders, and they all kind of spread out and went to all the ends of the earth, as they called it, and they all talked about Jesus and spread the good news. But two of them in particular had a huge role. One of them was Peter. Peter, Jesus said to him, "You are the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church." And so it was pretty much established by Jesus that Peter would be the leader of the church. After his ascension, Peter definitely becomes the leader. And he eventually ends up in Rome, where he leads the church from Rome until his own crucifixion. He was crucified on an X-shaped cross. He chose to be crucified, not X-shaped, an upside-down cross. He chose to be crucified this way because he didn't feel worthy of being crucified like Jesus. And then we have Paul, who actually wasn't one of the original apostles, and he actually never knew the actual human Jesus. But instead, he had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus. He was on his way to Damascus to round up Christians to take them back to Rome to persecute them. And anyway, he was knocked off his horse, blinded, and Jesus said, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And so he was blind for 3 days, but had this huge conversion experience. And then he changed his name from Saul to Paul. And eventually he went on 4 missionary journeys. He completed 3 of them. The 4th one he was arrested on. But in each of these missionary journeys, he would stop in all these towns. In each town, he would set up a church. He would form, leadership. And as soon as the leadership was competent to lead the church, then he would leave and go to another town. And when they had problems, they would send word to Paul. And then he would write letters to them. So there are 14 letters in the New Testament that claim that Paul wrote them. We only believe actually 7 of them were written by Paul. But regardless, Paul, even though he wasn't one of the original 12, and even though he didn't know the human part of Jesus, he did have an encounter with Jesus. And he did go on to spread the word and help others know Jesus. So he was incredibly important. One big thing that happened in the early church was the Council of Jerusalem. And this council was important. It's also known as the Jerusalem Council. But anyway, this council was very important because it was the first time the leaders of the church met to discuss doctrine of the church. And at that council, they were discussing the topic of Gentile conversion. Paul believed that he should spread the word about Jesus to everyone, not just Jewish people. St. James believed that only Jewish people were called to this message, and that if Gentiles wanted to become Christian, they should have to become Jewish first. Up until this time, Christianity was just seen as a specific type of Judaism. And this was about 49 AD when this happened. Anyway, they had a meeting. They argued about this topic. In the end, Peter sided with Paul, and it was decided that a person who wanted to become Christian did not have to be Jewish first. To become Jewish first would have meant they would have had to be circumcised, would have had to follow some dietary laws, some hygiene rules, and this council said that didn't have to happen. And this was the beginning of the split between Judaism and Christianity. One thing that Paul was very adamant about was how you were justified. And by justified, he means saved or salvation. Okay, how do you get to heaven? And he had been a Pharisee. The Pharisees were very strict followers of the law, very letter of the law people. And so when he had his conversion, he saw that as being wrong. And so he basically said, it's not your works that get you to heaven, it's your faith alone. And you have to remember when you hear this that St. Paul had been witnessing people going through the motion of, what he called empty works. We don't agree with Paul on that note as Catholics because we think it's a combination of your faith and good works, not empty works, but good works. And really, truly, we believe that if you have faith in Jesus, it will show through your actions. And so it's a combination of faith and works. As you read the chapter, it will overview for you some of the major churches, like the different cities that were centers for some major churches. Also, it will talk about the persecutions of Christians, which again were started by Nero. And so for about 300 years, Christianity, through different waves, were persecuted by the different emperors. Not all of them. Some of them left them alone, but many of them didn't. And so this brings up the topic of martyrs. People were martyred, meaning they were killed for their faith. There were also people called confessors who also, refused to denounce their faith in Jesus, but at the same time didn't get killed for it. And one thing that Paul speaks against is apostasy, which is totally giving up on the faith. So in this time, there started to be all these different people traveling around, preaching different things about Jesus and Christianity. And so many of those different ideas were called heresies eventually. And a heresy was a lie against the church, and their leader would be called a heretic. And one of those heresies was Gnosticism, which I'll talk about in a minute. But basically, to counteract this, some of the early church leaders became apologists. This means that they wrote apologies, which were defenses of the teachings of the church. One of the heresies you're going to read about is Gnosticism. And basically, Gnostics believed that there was a human birth, not a virgin birth. Christians believed that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. Gnostics didn't believe that. They believed a human being was born to Mary, and then the Spirit Christ inhabited this human Jesus long enough to walk the earth and pass on secret information to certain people and not everyone. And so if you were Gnostic at the time, you were someone who were privy to this secret information, and everyone else just was unaware of it. And so that was a really powerful heresy for a while, and it was declared a heresy. And again, the apologists would have written things to counteract the ideas of Gnosticism. One thing that was written is called the Didache, and this is kind of the earliest form of what today we call a catechism. It outlined for the first time in writing the teachings of the church. And you'll read about two important apologists, both Origen and Clement, both from Alexandria. So I hope you enjoy the reading. It's quite a bit this week. You do have a reading task due on Tuesday, so good luck with that, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.